we're kind of starting to brush up against a question which probably has no good, easy answer. And it's also a very broad yet very basic question, which is basically, why does anything happen? Why does anything rather than something else occur? Why is there this rather than that? Why did I choose A rather than B? I mean, if you could come up with the ultimate final answer to that question, you would probably solve a lot of problems in philosophy, psychology, sociology. Quite a lot of people would no longer have to go into work every day because you would have solved basically all of the problems. Unfortunately, or fortunately, I guess, depending on how you look at it, it's very doubtful that we're ever going to come up with a satisfying answer to that big question. Ultimately, why do I do what I do? What causes me to go left or right? What causes me to pick red or blue? Yes or no? And so on. And it might sound like these are the sort of questions which Marx would not be interested in the slightest, because these sound like rather abstract questions. And they certainly are. But this is an exception. Yes, Marx is not a big fan of metaphysics. Yes, Marx does not really like abstract, overly theoretical kind of speculations about the whys and wherefores of the world. But this is an exception, and it's a very important exception. Because in fact, it actually grounds a lot of the inquiry that Marx is exploring in his third thesis. 4 years before writing the thesis on Feuerbach, Marx was getting ready to graduate college and get his doctorate. And in order to obtain his doctorate, he was working on his dissertation. The title of that dissertation was, here's a mouthful, The Difference Between the Epicurean and Democritean Nature of Philosophy, Philosophy of Nature. Two different things. The difference between the Epicurean and Democritean philosophies of nature. And the reason this is important for Thesis 3 is because the Epicurean-Democritean debate, I guess you could call it, although they didn't live in the same time as one another, which was the subject of Marx's dissertation, actually kind of anticipates precisely the inquiry that he's exploring in Thesis 3, which is, broadly speaking, why do people choose one thing or another? Are we free to deviate from our preset paths? And of course, Marx thinks we are. But what exactly does that mean? What does that entail? So in any case, to cap things off, I want to throw out a new term that we haven't introduced in this series, which is kind of a philosophical, technical term, and that is causal relations. And the basic formula for a causal relation is that event C caused event E. So a causal relation is a relationship between two events, two things which occur, where one is the cause of the other. That's the very, very simple, basic version of that. For our purposes, we're asking questions like, what is the cause of event E, where event E represents, me choosing to break away from my previous education, me choosing to, strive against circumstances and acquire new educations, make new circumstances, forge new paths. In philosophy, we would call that an event, where someone deviates from the straight line. That would be an event. So what is the cause of that deviation, that swerve, that declination, whatever you want to call it? Well, Slavoj Žižek has probably one of my favorite ways of expressing this. He calls it the margin of freedom. And I'll post a link to the video where I'm taking this phrase from. It's from his Pervert's Guide to Ideology film. And he says that man is not merely subject to objective circumstances, because we all have a margin of freedom in which or through which we are able to subjectivize that objective reality or objective circumstances. In other words, basically what we've been talking about for arguably this whole series, all the way back to Thesis 1, where human beings, on Marx's view, are not just subject to external forces imposing themselves on us. We have the capacity, we have a margin of freedom, so a little bit of freedom, maybe just a little bit, but it's something. It's more than nothing, which the mechanical materialists, they give us no freedom. We get nothing, nada. But Marx gives us a margin of freedom. And he gives us a little bit of wiggle room. And that margin of freedom is where? It's right here. You see, and it encompasses the human being, and it encompasses the straight line, which represents, our circumstances and our education. That's what's pushing us forward. And the mechanical materialist view says that's all there is. If there is a deviation, then it's because your circumstances and education forced you to go that way. But basically, you're still just following your past. You can't actually choose to break away from that. And this all really goes back to Thesis 1 with Marx and his active side, which he says is absent in all previous materialism. And what's interesting is Marx is not the first philosopher to make this observation from within materialism itself. Remember, Marx is a materialist. His critique of materialism is not leading to an abandonment of materialism, although it seems like that at certain points in this text. No, Marx is and will remain a materialist, but he's trying to refine materialism. When he's critiquing it, he's trying to make it better, not break it down. And what's interesting is that Marx is not the first quote-unquote materialist to do so. And why do I say quote-unquote materialist? Well, fact of the matter is the terms materialist and idealist are not terms which have always been in use in philosophy. However, they do apply to many philosophers who predate the introduction of those terms. So in other words, there are plenty of philosophers going all the way back to ancient Greece who could be classed retroactively as materialists or idealists. An example of an idealist in ancient Greece could be Plato, with his theory of forms. It could be a form of idealism. Socrates, definitely not a materialist. The materialists in ancient Greece went by another name, called the atomists. Perhaps an equally problematic nomenclature, but we'll get to that later. For now, I want to introduce the quote that I have up here, which comes from one of those early ancient Greek materialists, one of those atomist philosophers, someone with whom Marx would have been very familiar, and that is the 1st century BC philosopher Lucretius, who wrote this book on the nature of the universe. And in this book, he writes the following: "If all movement is always interconnected, the new arising from the old in a determinate order, what is the source of the free will possessed by living things throughout the earth? What, I repeat, is the source of that willpower, snatched from the fates, whereby we follow the path along which we are severally led by pleasure, swerving from our course at no set time or place, but at the bidding of our own hearts?" Now, Lucretius was a student of another philosopher named Epicurus. Much like Socrates, Epicurus didn't really write a whole lot and relied on one of his students to write down the ideas he had. And so one of the projects that Lucretius embarked on as a philosopher himself was to defend his teacher Epicurus against Epicurus's many critics. And one of the big areas of criticism that Epicurus and Epicureanism had received was concerning its philosophy of nature, the way Epicureans looked at the world. We're going to go into more detail into Marx's relationship with Epicurus and early materialism in the next talk. But briefly, the reason we call Epicurus an early materialist is because his philosophy of nature was essentially a materialist one. He believed that the world was made of matter. He had a specific word for that, which we'll talk about next time. But basically, he thought the world was made of matter and nothing but matter. So he's a materialist. And as philosophers of nature, Epicurus and Lucretius don't immediately seem like they're talking about people and human activity. And when Lucretius is talking about all movement being interconnected, he's really only talking about the building blocks of the material world, what they call the atoms. And yet he is talking about human activity. He is talking about human beings. Why? Well, because we are also made of matter, just like everything else. And so what's interesting about what Lucretius says is how it relates to Marx's third thesis. Marx says that it is men who change circumstances. People are the ones that make things happen, make things the way they end up becoming. We're influenced by our environment, we're influenced by what we're given and presented in early childhood, what we're exposed to as we develop. All of that is true. Marx doesn't deny any of that. However, he thinks there is something else besides all that which allows for us to have some measure of freedom. And Lucretius, thousands of years before Marx, seemed to think that there was a similar problem in his fellow quote-unquote materialists. So it's interesting how, well, just as Hegel said, history repeats itself. And we see that here in the history of philosophy. This is kind of an analog to the debates Marx is having with other materialists. We see the same kind of debate happening thousands of years earlier. So when Lucretius says that all movement is interconnected, that's kind of the view that Marx identifies in Thesis 3 most clearly. You know, the idea that men are nothing but the products of circumstances and education, or circumstances and upbringing, as it's sometimes translated. So if our circumstances and our education or upbringing are just kind of commingling with one another, well, we're the products of those two external forces, meeting within us. And then our actions and our ideas are just nothing but the products of those things coming together and expressing themselves. And so you can see how this is also kind of the problem that Marx saw in Feuerbach, where he saw a lot of idealism in this so-called materialism. That's something we didn't really talk too much about because, quite honestly, that's kind of the undercurrent of a lot of Marx's criticism of his fellow materialists, is that they're really not materialists at all. But that's kind of that gets a little too technical, so I don't talk as much about that as I probably could. When Lucretius says the new arising always from the old in a determinate order, well, that should sound extremely familiar from what we just talked about in Thesis 3, because that's exactly how Marx is expressing the materialist view that we're the products of outside forces, imposing themselves on us. We don't have any agency. There's no creativity. But as Marx says, what this view forgets is that it is people who change circumstances and that the educator must be educated. We have to receive an education. But that doesn't preclude that we have some freedom, some wiggle room. And that's what I'm trying to sort of demonstrate here with the little stick figures are making a comeback here. So basically what you have here is you have a little baby and they're surrounded by red stuff and blue stuff. That can represent whatever you want. Maybe blue stuff is a particular religion or a particular political ideology. Maybe red stuff is particular behavior traits and personality patterns and things like that. You can fill it in with whatever you like. And as they develop, you've got this red stuff and blue stuff. What am I supposed to do with this? I guess I'll just do it. I guess I'll just agree with it. Why rock the boat? Then along comes some friend of theirs and they say, hey, why don't you combine these two things? Or why don't you do something that is hasn't been done yet? Do something that is revolutionary. That could mean protesting, or it could mean something as simple as, why don't you try taking a different route, maybe a slightly different route? And then they come up with purple stuff. Again, that can represent, whatever you like. So what we'll be looking at next time is the relationship between Marx and Epicurus. And we'll be taking a look at Marx's doctoral dissertation titled The Difference Between the Democritean and Epicurean Philosophies of Nature. This last part of the quote that I read from Lucretius' Nature of the Universe book, where he talks about swerving from our course at no set time or place, but at the bidding of our own heart. While this may seem a little bit too poetic for Marx, although before he was a philosopher, Marx was quite a poet himself, little known fact about him, that word, swerve, it's one that I've used a few times very deliberately, kind of trying to prep everybody for the introduction of this school of thought. That seemingly uninspiring word, swerve, plays a particularly important role in Lucretius's project in which he's trying to defend Epicurus. Epicurus had a certain idea about the way things worked in the world. Not a lot of people liked it. Not a lot of people understood it either. And Epicurus may not have been the best at explaining exactly what he thought. Lucretius comes along and comes up with this idea called the swerve. Sometimes people refer to it as the declination or the atomic swerve. And what this term means we'll be looking at in the next talk, and particularly paying attention to the way in which Epicurus' swerve, at least as Lucretius understands it, may have influenced Marx's own philosophy as a young, aspiring philosopher himself. I really think there's a case to be made for this. And it's something that I saw when reading Thesis and Feuerbach alongside Marx's dissertation. With that said, there are also some good reasons why this interpretation might not be so great after all. We'll also take a look at that next time too. I'm really looking forward to exploring Marx's relationship between these earlier philosophers because I find the history of philosophy very interesting, and I think Marx would agree. Also seemed to be someone who found philosophy's history very important to study. And as I've said a few times already in the last couple talks, I think this is where we really start to see Marx's, the importance of freedom in Marx's developing philosophy really starts to come to the fore here in his third thesis. So I hope you'll join me next time for talking about Marx and Epicurus and the swerve. Thanks.